This happened when I was 18. I'm 22 now. I live in San Antonio, Texas. It was my senior year of high school, but this was when COVID just started blowing up, so everything began to shut down, including my school. Even though everyone was supposed to be staying home and being in quarantine, my friend group and I were going out more than ever. There wasn't much to do since all the non-essential businesses were closed. But one thing about me, I love urban exploring, or exploring haunted places. To this day, I still do. I'm not one to scare easily. I've had a couple experiences with the homeless, cults, even had a gun pointed at me. But nothing compared to how odd and creepy this one instance I came across while exploring was. Moving forward, around this time, I started talking to a girl who I had a class with in high school. Her name was Clarissa. If it weren't for her matching my alibi of what happened this night, I'm sure none of my friends would have believed me. We were still kind of freshly dating, but I somehow convinced her to explore a wooded natural park at 3 a.m. here in San Antonio. The park is called OP Schnabel. It's relatively nice, safe, and very scenic during the day. But at night, it can be a dangerous place, and police usually roam the entrances to the area at night, keeping people away. In 2016, a 24-year-old woman named Lauren Bump was brutally murdered and stabbed over 20 times, and in 2021, a boy exploring the woods was shot. Clarissa and I get to the park around 3 a.m. It's super creepy and pitch black. The trees do a really good job at covering the moonlight. I don't like to have my flashlight on because then my eyes can't adjust to the darkness, and you can really only see what's lit up from the light. Plus, I wouldn't want someone to see my light from a far distance, so I like to keep them off while exploring. We were probably about 15 to 20 minutes in walking the main trail. I didn't plan to be in there for too long because it was kind of creepy and oddly quiet that night. I knew a trail that goes off the road that leads back to where my truck was parked. I told her we could take that trail, essentially making a full circle, instead of walking all the way back around. She agreed, and so we began walking through that off-road trail. We were probably only about 2 minutes into the off-road trail when suddenly, out of nowhere, a flute began playing. Clarissa and I stopped dead in our tracks and looked at each other, just listening. Whoever was playing it, it was super in cadence and sounded like it was playing some sort of piece of music. However, there was no time for me to process that it may have sounded good. It was creepy as fuck. As I said before, I don't scare easily, but 15 seconds into the flute solo, Clarissa began trembling in fear and on the brink of crying. I was kind of just listening, but when Clarissa started praying to God to save her and forgive her for her sins, that's when I realized the severity of the situation. To be clear, it was super hard to pinpoint where the sound of the flute was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the previous main trail, which was parallel to where we were, with about maybe 30 to 50 yards of woods in between. But it was getting louder and closer, to the point where it sounded like the sound was right on top of us. Clarissa couldn't even focus because she was so scared, so I knew I had to man up and get us out of this situation. This is gonna sound corny, but I told her, "Don't worry, I'm not gonna let anything happen to you," and told her that we should run down the off-road trail to get away. So we did. We began to sprint. I believe the flute stopped playing, but it was hard to notice because I was more focused on getting the hell out of there. We only got about 30 feet, when out of nowhere, we heard the rustling of bushes and the snapping of leaves and twigs before something big dashed across the trail right in front of us. Now, this could have very well been a deer or some sort of bigger wildlife, but it was so strange because I could almost feel the size of whatever was in front of us. I don't know if it was from the wind or what. The only thing is, I never saw a silhouette or a shape of anything in front of us. Another strange thing is, I didn't hear it coming and I didn't hear it run away. I only heard the dash right when it was right in front of us. As soon as we felt and heard whatever dashed across the trail right in front of us, we obviously turned back around and bolted in the other direction until we got back to the original point where we heard the flute. And then, as if whoever was playing it was waiting for us to return, the flute started to play again, loud and right on top of us. This time it was almost chiming. It sounded like it belonged to some sort of Irish jig song or something, but the chiming was still in cadence. However, it was still impossible to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was just surrounding us. At this point, my fight or flight instincts kicked in because we were trapped. We had two options: Either go back into the off-road trail where we heard that terrifying dash right in front of us, or go back to the main trail where the flute and whatever psychopath was playing it was at. The off-road trail was definitely scarier because it was darker and surrounded by more dense forest, and at least the main trail was a cement path. Thus, I told Clarissa, who was still trembling in fear, let's start running down the main trail back to the truck. We ran back. Adrenaline was still pumping, so we cut the 20-minute walk into a 7 to 8 minute jog. And somewhere along the run, the flute noise must have stopped. Along the run back, there was a random porta potty, and I was scared to death because what if someone was on the other side or hiding inside of it, because it seemed to be somewhat parallel to where we were at earlier. Thankfully, I didn't see anyone, or signs of anyone ever having been there. In fact, my truck was the only vehicle in the area near the main entrance to the woods. We made it to the truck, and I sped far away from there. The next day, I told all my friends about it, and I looked all over the internet to see if anyone's ever come across anything like this. People claim to run into ghosts, cults, animals making terrifying noises, but a soft and rhythmic flute solo, I couldn't find anything on that. Or maybe I just didn't look hard enough. I tried to figure out all the possibilities. There are some houses that eventually led into a neighborhood on the far edge of the woods, but those houses are at least a couple miles away, and we were fairly deep into the woods, so there's no way the sound could have traveled that far because I'm telling you, the flute was clear as day and it was 3 a.m. Obviously, I never found out who was playing that flute, or what dashed right in front of us. I actually kind of got chills writing the story. The more I think about it, it actually seems more paranormal rather than something scary on a tangible level. I don't know if it was a person, ghost, cult, or what. I'm really hoping someone might have a rational explanation. Either way, I never really went back to those woods at night. I still explore plenty of creepy places, but never really came across anything like that ever again. I'm a 20-year-old guy. I work at a medium-sized hospital in northwest Alabama as a pharmacy technician. I work an early night shift, 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. I'm also in charge of stocking the surgery rooms. I work for 7 days in a row, and then I have 7 days off. Working the 7 sucks, but the 7 off feels amazing. I work Thursday through Wednesday, and on my 6th night working, a Tuesday, I left a little early to go stay with my wife at her aunt's house, about 30 minutes away from our house. She was babysitting her little cousins while her aunt and uncle were on a trip. The house didn't have any curtains, so she felt uneasy for the few nights she was there. I didn't go with her at first because it was during my work week, and she told me there was really no point if I was going to get there around 5 a.m. and then go to sleep once the sun started to rise. But on her last night babysitting, she felt extremely anxious, so I told her I was coming over. She is stubborn, but she thanked me and felt so much better once I arrived. Working the night shift for the last 2 years has really taken a toll on me mentally, and I think I've started to develop some slight insomnia. I literally could not go to sleep after getting to my wife's aunt's house. This isn't anything new, but I had never stayed up for more than about 28 hours before. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't sleep because we had a really big day ahead of us. We had to drop her little cousins off at school, our friend was having a gender reveal party, we had to go shopping because we had no groceries at home since she had been away for the last 3 days, and I had to be at work at 6 p.m. I ended up falling asleep in the car for a little less than 10 minutes. I was really feeling that wave of sleepiness come over me, but I ended up getting a huge Red Bull and another energy drink once I got to work. I had my wife drive me to work and pick me up since my brakes needed to be changed and I wasn't driving my car, and also because neither of us trusted myself to drive her car on over 24 hours of no sleep. It was Wednesday night now, and I had been awake since about 2 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. My shift started out fine. If I could stay busy, that tired feeling wouldn't really get to me. I put in my earbuds and was listening to music as I was stocking the surgery rooms with their meds. It was a weeknight, so there were still some late surgeries finishing up, and housekeeping was cleaning up some operating rooms that had been used. It's not uncommon for surgery personnel to come into the room I was in and grab something that the room they were using may be out of, so I usually turn around and at least smile, and they smile back. I was in my own little world, stocking the Omnicell machine with meds and listening to music, when I heard the door behind me open. There was that distinct high-pitched squeal when a door needs its hinges to be oiled. It made the loud crash that heavy wooden doors make when they shut, so I turned around to see who it was like always, except there was no one there. I didn't really get worried about it. Maybe they opened the door and saw I was in there and just decided to go to another room, so I continued on. As I pushed my cart to the next room, the light in this room was off. I opened the door, and I swear I saw someone hunched over by the Omnicell machine, digging through the sharps bin. If you don't know what that is, it's a bin where you dispose of needles and vials after use instead of just putting them in a normal garbage can. Someone had already been caught doing this before in search of morphine and consequently was fired. I turned on the light and was going to ask what they were doing, but when I turned the light on, there was no one there. Okay, now I was starting to get a little creeped out. I didn't know the time frame of when you could start hallucinating after not sleeping for over 24 hours, so I just told myself I was probably seeing things and needed to just calm down. I finished up stocking surgery with no other occurrences and headed back to the pharmacy. At 2 a.m. every night, we have to deliver patient-specific medications to the nurses' station. I'm going to use the 5th floor as an example of how the floors are laid out, but each floor number corresponds with which floor they were on. There are 3 elevators in the middle of the floor. If you go left when getting off the elevator, there's the 5100 and 5200 side, and if you go to the right, there's the 5400 to 5500 side. There are 2 wings on each side, so there are patient rooms numbered 5105 to 5115, and the other wing has rooms 5201 to 5215. Each floor is laid out the exact same way, so each wing has 15 rooms on each side. To shorten the floor names though, I'm going to refer to them as 51, 52, and 54, 55. Recently, the 5th floor, specifically the 54, 55 side, had been undergoing some remodeling, so our overflow floor, the 3rd floor, was where they put the patients who were on the 54, 55 side of the 5th floor while they remodeled. The 54, 55 side was empty because there weren't that many people in the hospital that night. I made my way up the hospital, delivering meds to the nurses' station floor by floor, until I got to the 5th floor. I went to the 51, 52 side, delivered the meds, and decided to go check out the progress of the 54, 55 side. As I went over there, I just got creeped out. There were no nurses, no patients, just the long, empty hallways. The surgery rooms are already empty and desolate most nights, so I'm used to walking around down there no problem. But seeing empty patient rooms just creeped me out. I walked slowly down the 55 side. I heard a noise that sounded like one of the hospital beds rattling. As I passed 5512, I quickly found out what the noise was. As I looked into the rooms, I saw an old man violently shaking as if he was having a seizure. Blood was running down his eyes, nose, and out of his mouth. He was making this gargling, groaning sound, almost like the sounds the zombies in The Walking Dead make. A monitor was frantically beeping like it does when a patient is coding. My heart dropped when I saw this, and I took a quick step behind the doorframe. I immediately stepped back into the room as I realized this man was in desperate need of medical attention. But when I looked back in there was no man. This bed was clean and made. The monitor was off, and there were no signs that anyone had even been in that room for at least a whole day. I thought at that point I was for sure hallucinating. I quickly made my way back over to the elevators, and I made my way back down to the 1st floor where the pharmacy is. As the elevator doors opened, an old man in a security shirt and hospital badge got on the elevator. He patted my shoulder as he walked past me. It was that same man I had seen moments before having a seizure and making those zombie-like noises. He smiled at me as the doors closed, and I watched the numbers on the elevator go all the way up to the 5th floor. I didn't push the button for the elevator to come back down, but the same elevator came back down to the 1st floor and opened. There was no one on the elevator. I ran back to the pharmacy and sat in a chair for the rest of my shift until my wife came and picked me up. As I was waiting, I googled when hallucinations start when you haven't slept. It said between 30 and 48 hours, and I was on hour 38 of no sleep, so it made sense. The pharmacy is located directly under the 54-55 side, so when I walk in, I can see the window at the end of the hospital wing on the 24, 34, 44, and 54 side. Sometimes as I wait on the elevator on that side to go back down to the pharmacy, I look out the window. As I was walking out to my wife's car, I looked back up at the 5th floor window and saw the same old man looking at me through the window. I got chills as I got into my wife's car. I didn't say anything about what I saw that night. I'm not sure why I would have hallucinated that specific man, as I've never seen him before, and even if I have, he has no significance in my life whatsoever. I'm still not sure, though, if that was even a hallucination, or if what I saw that night was real. It certainly felt real. I went to sleep immediately after getting home. I've not seen that man again, but this was just under 2 weeks ago. I live with my boyfriend in his house that he owns. It's a modest house in a good neighborhood. Violent crime here is typically low. I say it's a modest house because compared to the other houses in the neighborhood, it's on the smaller side. But having a smaller house in this neighborhood is still very desirable because it allows us to still live in a nice town without owning a multi-million-dollar home. It's a single-floor, 3-bed and 2-bathroom house with a basement. We're on a very quiet block with a lot of privacy. The way the street curves provides this optimal privacy, as when we step outside of the house, there's not a single neighboring house directly facing us. There are 8 houses total on our block. Further down the block is a small wooded area. My boyfriend Mika was away one weekend in Vegas for a bachelor party last October. I was alone from Thursday to Monday. Friday after work, I had some of my girls over for a wine night. At some point while we were in the living room watching scary movies, the doorbell rang. We all went quiet and looked at one another with the same faces. The doorbell ringing late at night while watching a scary movie almost felt not real. I went to go sneakily see if I could see who was outside on the porch, but I couldn't get a view from the window. There is a tiny glass panel at the top of the door, so I peeked through it. There were like 4 cars in the driveway. They had to know people were home, but I didn't see anyone on the porch. I went back to my friends, and while we all agreed that was weird, we accepted that it was just a very unfortunately timed ding-dong ditch. After everyone left, it was late enough for me to go to bed and fall asleep right away. But I was awoken that night, not even an hour later, to the doorbell ringing twice. I looked at my phone and it was like 1 a.m. No one belongs outside your door at this hour. I immediately called Mika, and he picked up sounding really drunk in a loud bar. He had to go to a bathroom to be able to hear me. Once he heard me, he told me to just stay in the bedroom and not open the door to anyone. He never once suggested calling the police, so I refrained from doing that for now. We ended our call, and I tried to just stay calm and go back to sleep. Just as my heart rate started to slow and I started to calm down, I heard something from outside. Some kind of clicking sounds until there was a knock at my window. And a male's voice said, "Hey, anyone home? I need some help out here." I thanked the Lord the blinds were closed. I couldn't see who was out there, and they couldn't see me. Instead of leaving, he knocked again on the window. He said, "I know you're home." This was what prompted me to call the police. I never heard the man outside walk away from the window. For all I knew, he was still standing outside of it. So I whispered the entire time while on the phone, reporting someone trying to break into my house. Call me dramatic or an embellisher, but I was scared and I wanted the police here ASAP. Within 5 to 10 minutes, the doorbell rang again, followed by loud knocks. I went out and approached the front door and asked who it is. A male's voice said it's the police. It was a different voice from the other guy. I looked through the glass and confirmed it was a couple police officers. I opened the door for them, and right off the bat, the taller officer in front walked right into my house without my even inviting him in. He said they were responding to my report of a disturbance, and I said there's a man lurking around the house ringing the bell and knocking on my window. I don't want to make a big part of my recounting this story about this particular police officer, but he was the rudest man I'd ever met. I felt like he was on a power trip. He was demeaning towards me, telling me to shush and talking over me while I was trying to explain. He also didn't seem to take my claims very seriously. His partner didn't say a word, he just stood in the back. The taller one asked me details that I'd already made clear I wouldn't have, such as what the man looked like, when I clearly stated that I hadn't seen him, and the officer actually said to me, "Well, you're the one who called us, ma'am. If you don't want our help, we can leave." I was taken aback completely. I'd never called the police before, and I never expected such a lack of professionalism. I apologized and said I'm just scared. It was around this time that the 2 officers walked around the house with their flashlights. They went full circle and then came back, but But honestly, they didn't really check very thoroughly. I watched them through the windows. They came back to the door and told me there's nothing they can do if I don't have any cameras or proof of the man trying to commit any wrongdoing. The two cops then left. I didn't feel any better at all, besides the fact that maybe whoever that man was saw I called the police. I went back to bed, and thankfully the next time I woke up was to sunlight creeping in through the closed blinds. It was around 10 a.m. It was Saturday, and that night my friend was having a Halloween party that I was going to help set up for. During the day, I did a little grocery shopping, and while I was at it, picked up some things for the party. My costume was Velma from Scooby-Doo, and my friend throwing the party was Daphne. I got to her house around 6 p.m. The party started at 9, and it really picked up around 10:30. I was there pretty late, like I probably left her house a little after 1 a.m. I was good to drive, as I didn't really drink much besides a few beers. When I got home, I immediately noticed a cool draft in the house. After setting my things down on the dining room table, I noticed a window open. I went to shut it, trying to remember why I would have opened it. I went to brush my teeth, but then when I came out from the bathroom, I noticed the basement door was wide open. I froze. This was when I started hearing this faint but consistent clicking sound. As I got closer to the basement stairs, I realized it was coming from down there. And then I got to the top of the stairs, and I looked down to the pitch-black basement, and the clicking suddenly stopped. A voice from below suddenly said, "You're finally home." With that, I slammed the basement door shut and took my phone with me outside. I banged on the neighbor's door until he answered, and I chose to call the police in the safety of my neighbor's house. It was unfortunately the same two officers who returned to my house. My neighbor accompanied me as I went to speak with them this time, and I think that may have had some kind of impact on that taller cop's attitude. He wasn't as rude this time. He and his partner checked the house while my neighbor and I stood in the living room. Eventually, after their initial search, I showed them some of the spots I'd imagined someone could be hiding. I basically tore the entire house upside down, while also on the phone with my drunk boyfriend. When I was sure that no one was here anymore, I packed a bag to go stay with my sister until Mika came back. This time I locked every window before leaving. The main takeaway lesson from my story is if you have windows that open wide enough for someone to crawl through, make sure they're always locked when they're closed. We still live in this house today, but for a few months, I refused to be alone in the house for extended periods. I still have PTSD from this, and sometimes I have nightmares in which I think I'm hearing knocks at the window, and then I wake up.
Story 1. Echoes of the Forest. It used to be my weekly ritual to go camping in the woods near my house. In the past, the woods always had a special charm, making me feel blessed whenever I spent time wandering beneath their foliage. Especially in the fall season, when the woods lost their usual green and painted the earth with magnificent red hues, the sight offered me a sense of escapism from the monotony of daily life. Sadly, I could not feel the same way about the woods now, taking account of the unexplainable horror that happened to me just a few months ago. That day started off normally as I traveled to my usual camping spot. After setting up my tent, I decided to explore the surroundings and gather more dry wood to build a fire for my camp. The forest seemed alive, with branches swaying in the gentle breeze and rustling softly above my head. At first, I set off on a path I had walked many times before. Then, a strange pull urged me to explore nature a bit further, and I ended up wandering farther from my campsite than I intended. That's when I stumbled upon a trail I had never seen before. It was partially hidden by overgrown bushes and fallen leaves, and I almost didn't notice it at first glance. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the trail. I still remember how my surroundings weirdly changed as I traveled deeper. The trail grew darker, the temperature drastically dropped, and even the air hung thicker and heavier somehow. At that time, I didn't think much of the changes. Attributing them to the increasing density of the trees around me, I kept on walking. Stood at the end of the trail was a dilapidated old cabin, seemingly abandoned for decades. The wooden house was a haunting sight, standing in stark contrast to the natural beauty of the forest. Its wooden walls were weathered and covered in moss, the roof sagging under the weight of time. Windows were broken, and the front door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. A chill suddenly ran down my spine as I approached the front yard of the abandoned cabin. Vines had crawled up the sides, and the steps leading to the porch were cracked and crumbling. I stepped cautiously onto the rickety porch, the wood groaning under my weight. Pushing the door open, I was greeted by a musty smell, a mix of damp wood and rot. The interior was just as decrepit as the exterior. Cobwebs adorned the corners, and dust covered the empty floor entirely. The only furniture left inside was a chair, standing alone by a broken window. I moved through the vacant rooms of the cabin. All shared the same look, empty and dusty. The property was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards under my feet. I made my way to the last room at the back of the house, expecting to see the same scenery. However, my eyes caught something completely out of place, a thick metal door. It stood in stark contrast to the rest of the house, which was entirely made of wood. The door was bolted shut and looked new and solid, almost industrial, as if it belonged to a different era or place entirely. Hesitant for a moment, I then approached the door. A mix of fascination and dread swirled inside me as I got closer. Then I heard it, a faint sound of chains rattling, accompanied by an eerie, gurgling noise. I was stunned and thought I had misheard the sound at first, but then the rattling of chains happened again. The gurgling noise followed, along with the sound of several steps moving on the creaking floor toward me, which then halted right behind the metal door. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. Something was standing behind this thick door, and it knew of my presence. The most rational possibility I could think of was a guard dog, but I wasn't sure, as the noise it made didn't sound like a dog's growl at all. Whatever was behind that door was not something I wanted to encounter. Panic took hold, and I turned to flee. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked away from the house, a sense of uneasiness hanging over me. The trail that had seemed so inviting suddenly felt like a trap. I quickened my pace as I saw the familiar track leading back to my campsite ahead, not daring to look back. When I finally reached my campsite, I didn't stop for a second to rest. The safety of my tent no longer seemed enough. I hastily gathered my belongings. The woods that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. I moved my camp to a spot closer to the edge of the forest, hoping that the distance would bring some measure of safety. When the night came and I sat by the new fire, feeling much more secure, the thoughts of the house and the metal door still haunted my mind. A million questions uncontrollably popped into my head. What was behind it? Why was it there? The questions swirled in my mind, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never venture down that trail again. Deciding not to disturb myself further, I went inside my tent and tried to sleep, naively believing danger was miles away. The rustling of leaves and brushes woke me up in the middle of the night. Half asleep, I dismissed it as the noise of some wild animals, perhaps a deer or a squirrel, and tried to drift off to sleep again. The rustling quickly turned into a loud thud, and this time my eyes flew open, adrenaline coursing through my veins, jolting me awake immediately. Someone was drawing near my camp. My heart raced as I saw an ominous shadow slowly casting onto my tent. The shape of it suggested it was a woman. Fearing the worst, I grabbed an axe nearby, unsure whether to speak up or remain silent. Each second felt like an eternity. I kept glancing toward the dark figure, half expecting to see the strange woman take a few steps closer to my tent. However, she kept standing at the same spot. I clutched my axe tightly in my hand and decided to shout aloud, "Hello, miss! Do you need something?" The figure remained still and gave no reply. "Leave if you don't need anything," I solemnly warned, lowering my voice as deep as possible. The figure remained still and gave no reply. The tension intensified, and just as I intended to walk out and confront the strange woman, she gave in. Her shadow gradually moved away from my tent and disappeared into the dark woods. I breathed out, relieved that the eerie figure was gone. After waiting a few minutes following the woman's departure, I summoned all the courage left within me, stepped outside, and hastily began packing up my camp. I fled during the night. The walk back to my house was a blur, my mind occupied with thoughts of what I had encountered. I vowed never to speak of it, hoping that silence would keep the nightmares at bay. However, the morning after the night I had to flee from the woods, a friend of mine, who happened to be a police officer, called me and asked if I had seen anything unusual at my camping site. He informed me that there were people being murdered inside the woods. The news made my stomach tighten in knots. I told him about my horrifying camping experience, providing as much detail as possible. However, when the police inspected the cabin in the woods, they found no metal door, as I described. Eventually, their investigation came to a dead end, and they dropped the case. Several months had passed since that terrifying camping trip. A few more murders occurred in the woods, and hikers went missing, all near my usual camping spot. People in town soon whispered about how the woods were cursed, and no soul dared to wander near them. For my part, I still can't wrap my head around what really happened. Despite feeling lucky to have managed to get out alive, the experience in the abandoned house and the creepy encounter with the woman left a lasting impact on me. It haunted my dreams for weeks, and I found myself avoiding the woods. Even now, as I recount this story, a chill runs down my spine. Story 2: Massacre at the camping site. The incident happened the summer I turned 12. After celebrating a small birthday party with my mom, my dad and I planned a father and son camping trip for the next day, a tradition we practice nearly every year. The spot we chose was somewhat remote, with few people around, providing the solitude we were both seeking. However, the camping spot was still accessible by car. Dad and I packed up the car with camping gear, food supplies, and other necessities to live in the wilderness for 3 days. We departed early in the morning and reached our destination when the summer sun was already high above, beating down on the highway with unbearable heat. However, as we traveled deeper into the campsite, the air became cooler as the forest foliage grew denser, offering us much needed shade from the intense sun rays. We left our car at the parking lot and decided to walk further into the forest on foot. Following a small trail, we were surrounded by nothing but the greenery of the forest trees. There were no other hikers or campers to be found, just me and my dad alone on a desolate path. Not until we reached the riverside did we see a camping tent and a car parked next to it. The haunted scene halted my steps. The tent was ripped in several places, flapping in the wind like a ghostly figure waving us down. The inside was a mess of scattered belongings, clothes, a broken lantern, and a couple of sleeping bags covered in dirt. The car looked even worse, with rust eating away at its body and the doors hanging open, its tires deflated, suggesting it had been there for months. The chaotic scene made it seem as if someone had been camping here and then hastily abandoned their spot for some peculiar reason. Or worse, they could be attacked. My dad halted his steps too. He appeared at the scene, furrowing his eyebrows. His gaze told me he also felt something was not right. I asked him what could have happened here, but he spoke of no theories. He only suggested we go camping on higher ground, far from the eerie scene before us. Despite the unsettling discovery, we pressed on. The narrow road seemed to close in around us, the trees growing denser with every mile we ventured deeper. My dad seemed to notice that the sight of the abandoned campsite still troubled me, and began to chat about the fun activities we had planned. Fishing, hiking, and roasting marshmallows by the campfire. Eventually, we reached our desired spot. It was dry, high ground overlooking the water, to the right of the road. Another trail crossed it, leading up to even higher ground in the forest, but we decided to camp along the riverbank. As we set up our tent, I glanced down the slope and saw another family camping near the riverbank. They had a large tent and seemed to be enjoying themselves. 2 kids, around my age, playing by the water while their parents prepared dinner. The sight of them brought some comfort, reminding me that we weren't completely alone in the woods. I forgot all about the abandoned tent when the sun began to set. My dad built a campfire, and we sat around it, roasting steak and telling stories. He talked a lot about his memories of camping with Grandpa when he was a kid, just like we were doing now. The night went on peacefully, with no disturbance. Occasionally, laughter from a nearby family echoed back at us, and my dad immediately repeated his intention to persuade my mom to join us camping in the near future. However, as the darkness deepened, a strange feeling of being watched began to cloud my mind. Growing up, I was always a sensitive kid with a strong sense of intuition, especially when I sensed something awful could happen. It likely would. I tried to engage more in the conversation with my dad, hoping the uneasy feeling would go away. Despite the comfort of the campfire and my dad's reassuring presence, the feeling still lingered. At last, we crawled into our tent to rest. I lay there, staring up at the canvas ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. My dad's steady breathing beside me was a small comfort, but the silence outside was unnerving. It felt like the forest was holding its breath with me, waiting for something to happen. I drifted off to sleep, unaware of the passing time, until my dad shook me awake in the dark. My eyes flew open as he whispered in my ear that we needed to move fast. Sensing something terrible was happening, I quickly sat up and began gathering my stuff in a hurry alongside my dad. A woman's scream suddenly pierced the air, shattering the tranquility of the forest. My blood ran cold as I heard another, and then another. Desperate, terrified cries echoing through the trees. With trembling hands, I zipped my backpack closed and crawled out of the tent. The outside world was pitch black, with no stars or moon rising above. I foolishly tried to turn on the flashlight, but my dad snatched it from me just in time before the light could flicker on. He signaled for me to keep quiet and follow his instructions. It was too dark for me to see anything clearly, but the eerie sounds were vivid enough to suggest a bloodbath was happening below us. The parents' frantic shouts for their children were abruptly silenced. I heard them beg for mercy, and then, horrifyingly, the unmistakable sound of blood spattering against the canvas filled the air, nearly making me choke with fear. In just a brief moment, the forest fell back into silence. However, this time, the silence was too loud to bear. My dad grabbed my arm, pulling me back, urging me to go. Never in my life had I heard his voice quiver as it did in that moment of terror. In the utter darkness, blood pulses drummed in my ears as we hurriedly made our way back to the trail leading up the mountain. The screams were gone, leaving us with the horrified sound of the killers laughing and chatting. It took us more than an hour to make it back to the parking lot. We threw everything into the car and jumped in, my dad fumbling with the keys in his haste to start the engine. The tires spun on the gravel before finding traction, and we sped away from the campsite. My heart refused to stop pounding as we drove through the night. My mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. What had we just witnessed? Who, or what, had attacked that family? The questions haunted me, but one thing was clear. We had narrowly escaped a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life.
Last month, I went camping by myself for the first time. My older brother, who usually accompanied me, had just moved away to university, leaving me to venture into the wilderness alone. Since I was used to camping with my older brother and always relied on him to look after me, taking a solo trip was quite a challenge. However, I felt confident, as my brother had taught me a lot about surviving in the wild during our trips together. To ensure I could handle everything smoothly on my own, I carefully set up a plan. I chose a well-known camping spot for my first solo trip, a place we had visited many times before, just 3 hours south of where I lived. It was a safe bet, considering I was new to camping alone, The site was always bustling with fellow campers, and I hoped to make new friends who shared the same camping hobby as I, meticulously planning every detail of my trip. I listed everything on paper, from the route I would take to the supplies I needed. Since the forecast predicted rain on the day of my departure, I decided to go camping with my car and left my scrambler at home. The morning I set off was overcast, with a chill in the air that hinted rain was coming. I rolled down the window, pleased to feel the moist, damp air of the forest surrounding me. The autumn landscape blurred past in shades of gray and brown, with trees, some already stripped of their leaves, standing like skeletal sentinels along the roadside. The road was more desolate than I had expected, with barely a car in sight. I thought there would be more people when I arrived. However, when I finally reached the campsite, it was eerily quiet, with only a few other campers and hikers scattered about, their presence barely noticeable. The unusual sight caught me off guard, but I brushed it off, attributing it to nerves. The bleak sky brightened a bit when I found a spot to camp near a small stream, just as I had planned. I set up my tent and prepared lunch, feeling content as I listened to the gentle babbling of the flowing water nearby. As I sat there, chewing on a sandwich and thinking nothing could go wrong, I suddenly heard a rustling sound coming from the nearby brush. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to hear any further movement. This area was widely known for having no bears or dangerous predators, so I naturally assumed it was just a squirrel or a deer. The rustling happened again. This time, I heard the sound coming from above, closer to where I had camped. My eyes caught a glimpse of the branches swaying awkwardly, as if something had just jumped onto them. The sound ceased as abruptly as it had started, leaving me in a tense silence. I felt something was watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal and dismissed the uneasy feeling, but it lingered. Hastily finishing my lunch, I decided to move my camp to a more open space near the riverbank, hoping that the visibility would ease my mind. I drove deeper into the wilderness, the road becoming narrower and more winding. I passed a couple of hikers. Their faces were weary and serious as they talked with one another. They were the only humans in sight. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, with the trees growing denser and darker with each mile I drove. Eventually, I reached my destination. Emerging from the dense forest, I was greeted by a large, flat area surrounding a serene lake. I rode along the shore, searching for the perfect spot to settle. Scattered around were a few tents, and the smoke from their campfires calmed my mind, making me feel less isolated. I stopped and set up my tent again on dry ground, free of wet grass. From where I stood, I could see almost the entire lake. It was not large and was closely surrounded by the forest, but still, the lake offered the vast openness that I needed. It was a much better place to camp compared to the cramped confines of the forest. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Despite sitting close to my campfire, I had to put on another sweater to keep warm. A thin veil of fog began to crawl along the shore, swirling around me like a ghost. The night was pitch black, with no moon or stars visible, as clouds blanketed the entire sky. Occasionally, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the thick dunes of clouds, and I knew it was about to rain. I initially planned to sleep in my tent, but as the first raindrops fell, I changed my mind. The solid walls of the vehicle offered a semblance of comfort that the thin fabric of the tent could not. Tempted by the added protection, I decided to sleep inside my car, not knowing this random decision would save my life from the worst possible fate. A blood-curdling scream jolted me awake in the middle of the night. I sat up abruptly, a sense of dread growing with each passing minute. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically looked around. The fog had hung thicker, rolling in and shrouding the landscape in a ghostly white veil, blocking my vision in all directions. The rustling of the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig sounded amplified in the dense fog. Another scream echoed faintly from a distance. This one belonged to a man. His cries for help were filled with terror, making my blood run cold. Something terrible was happening nearby. Instinctively, I checked if the door was locked and huddled under the blanket, trying to block out the noise and the fear. The fog outside seemed to grow thicker as the temperature dropped, making it feel like I was stuck in the depths of winter. My eyes widened as I saw frost gradually forming on my car window. That's when I heard it, the wet, sloshing sound of something emerging from the river. The splashing of water was soon followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. They grew louder as they approached my car. My heart dropped as I saw shadowy figures moving through the fog. Fear tightened its grip around my throat as the figures circled around the campsite. their shapes barely discernible in the dense mist. A dark figure stopped right in front of my car window where I lay. I slowly pulled the blanket over my head and held my breath. A low gurgling sound shattered the quietness, and my entire body froze in fear. The figure leaned in closer. It knocked on my car window. The sound was soft but insistent, as if whatever was standing outside was trying to discern if I was inside. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it was all a nightmare, but the knocking continued, tormenting my soul. Suddenly it banged on the car window, hard and fast. The sudden aggressive movement caught me off guard, but miraculously I did not flinch. Perhaps my nerves were too numb to even react. Finally the figure moved away, and I allowed myself to let out a gentle breath of relief. However, the danger still lurked outside my campsite. I heard more sounds of the cold surface being disturbed as those dark figures emerged from it, their footsteps steady as they moved into the forest. Screams, more screams echoed from all around the lake and from the depths of the forest. I lay still under the blanket, too terrified to move. The night seemed endless, each minute stretching into an eternity. When the first light of dawn finally appeared, I felt a surge of relief. The fog began to dissipate, revealing the familiar landscape of the campsite. As soon as my surroundings were light enough to see, I grabbed my keys and bolted from the car. I didn't bother packing up my camp. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. My hands trembled as I started the engine, and I took one last look at the campsite before speeding away. The drive back felt surreal. The once desolate road now seemed like a lifeline, leading me away from the horror I had experienced. The bleak autumn landscape, which had seemed so beautiful and haunting on the way in, now felt oppressive and menacing. I could not make sense of anything that had happened to me that night, and even to this day, the memory still haunts me. The screams, the fog, the eerie figures. It was a lesson learned the hard way. Some places, no matter how familiar, can be terrifying when you're alone. From that day on, I never ventured into the wilderness without company. The experience left a scar on my psyche, a constant reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Last summer, after graduating from college, I decided to spend my last summer break returning to my usual go-to camping site, located within a national park and just an hour or two drive north of my university. I set off for my trip early in the morning. After more than an hour on the highway, I approached the exit that led to the national park. The sign was weathered but clear, pointing towards a winding mountainous road that led to my final destination. I turned the steering wheel and entered the winding road. The dense forest soon replaced the open fields. Towering trees cast long shadows across the road. I finally turned off the mountain road and went down a path that led to an open valley. Looking ahead, the campsite is already settled in the middle of the valley. The ground was a mix of soft grass and packed dirt, making it ideal for pitching tents and setting up camp. However, I had no intention of camping there. After parking my car, I carried my heavy backpack and ventured deep into the wilderness. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the sight of other hikers became increasingly rare, yet the trail showed signs of frequent travel. It was wide and flat in the middle, with grass growing on either side. I felt somewhat lucky to find this surprisingly easy trail to travel in the wilderness. However, after a few hours of hiking, my patience ran thin with this seemingly convenient trail, as I could not find a single suitable spot to set up my tent. That was when I stumbled across another track. It was much smaller than the one I was on. Thinking the new route might lead me to a clearing, I decided to change my course. The trees along this track became less dense, but their foliage was much thicker than those off the track. I felt my heart racing with excitement and a bit of nervousness as I beheld the abnormal tree trunks. They grew taller and bigger as I ventured deeper into the woods. Then, gradually appearing from behind the massive oak tree, a curious building stood as tall as the trees surrounding it. I gasped at the size of the cabin. It was large and dilapidated, almost resembling a manor, built entirely of wood. I checked my watch. It was just past midday. Needing a place to rest for lunch, I let curiosity get the better of me and decided to go inside the cabin. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was a stark contrast to the outside, dark and foreboding. Dust particles danced in the beams of light that filtered through the cracked windows. Old furniture draped in white sheets lined the walls, and cobwebs hung like ghostly drapes from the ceiling. The air was thick with a musty scent of decay. It felt as though the house had been abandoned for decades, yet there was an inexplicable sense of presence, as if the house itself were alive. As I cautiously explored the rooms, I found myself drawn towards the basement door. A loud banging noise rumbled through the creaking staircase beneath me. The impact happened again, and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest as the basement vibrated violently. It was a rhythmic, almost mechanical sound, as if something or someone was trying to break free. Panic surged through me, and without a second thought, I bolted from the cabin, my mind refusing to consider what could have caused that noise. On my way out, I passed a group of young people. They laughed and shouted, oblivious to the eerie presence of the cabin. They had even built a big fire in the middle of the front yard. It was clear that the unruly teenagers were about to party here. "There's something in there. Don't go in. This property is haunted," I warned them. Some noticed me and laughed out loud. "The Duke has awakened, people," some young lad shouted, and the rest cheered along with him. Knowing I could not do much to convince them otherwise, I left the cabin and went on my way. I eventually found my camping spot, a clearing near a gentle babbling stream. I set up my tent and camping gear. From where I stood, the roof of the old cabin was still visible through the canopy of trees. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled in my gut and focus on the task at hand. As night fell, I sat by my campfire. The crackling flames provided a comforting glow. The peaceful sounds of the forest were occasionally interrupted by the distant laughter and music of the young people that I had passed earlier. They were having a party, their voices carrying through the trees. The sky was clear, and the stars twinkled overhead, providing a stark contrast to the dark thoughts swirling in my head. I tried to focus on the beauty of the night and the serenity of my surroundings, but the loud party noise from the cabin kept disturbing me. I clicked my tongue in annoyance, but then the party sound stopped abruptly. The silence was so sudden and complete that it made my skin crawl. I strained my ears, bracing myself for the inevitable. The blood-curdling screams of the young people echoed through the night. The screams were filled with terror and pain, each one more desperate than the last. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I quickly doused my fire, plunging myself into darkness. I crouched low, straining to hear any signs of danger. The forest, which had been so inviting during the day, now seemed like a maze of shadows and threats. The screams continued, mingling with sounds of chaos, branches snapping, footsteps running, and indistinct shouts. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. Grabbing my essentials, I carefully navigated through the darkness, moving away from the source of the screams. Each step was filled with dread, and my senses were heightened by fear. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs made me jump. I avoided using my flashlight, not wanting to draw any attention to myself. The moonlight, though dim, provided just enough illumination to guide my way. My only thought was to get as far away as possible to find safety. The sounds of the party, now horrific, faded as I put more distance between myself and the cabin. As I moved deeper into the woods, I could hear my own heavy breathing and the pounding of my heart. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely keeping my footing. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. I kept moving, driven by adrenaline and fear. Once I reached a safe distance, I paused to catch my breath, judged my location, and found the way back to where my car was parked. After settling into my seat and driving away from the campsite, I called 911 to report the attack deep in the forest. In the days that followed, I scoured the news and online forums for any information about what had happened that night. To my disbelief, there was nothing. No reports of missing people, no accounts of strange occurrences. It was as if the incident had never happened. I even returned to the area a week later, during daylight, to look for any signs of what might have happened. The cabin was still there, standing ominously in the same spot, but there were no signs of the young people or their party. It was as if they had vanished without a trace. The experience left me haunted, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had taken root in my mind. I haven't been camping since, and I doubt I ever will again. The memory of that night, the screams, the eerie cabin in the woods still haunt my dreams. I've tried to move on and focus on other things, but the fear lingers. The woods, once my sanctuary, now feel like a place of danger and unknown terrors. I suppose some mysteries are better left unsolved, but I can't help but feel that the truth is out there, waiting to be uncovered by someone brave or foolish enough to look for it.